Hey everyone, it is your old pal Jeff Horowitz, and I am here representing Dentist in the Know. As you know, this is Hump Day Happy Hour. It's Wednesday. It's a friggin' cold night here in the Myrtle Beach area. We don't get it that often, and we've already had a bunch of really cold nights. So I don't know what's going on. So I'm just happy to be inside right now. Our guest tonight rubbed it in my face already. He's coming from St. Pete, Dr. Drew McDonald. He's sitting outside. He's sipping some kind of a really cold drink, and I think he's got a tube top on or something like that. But anyway, really excited to be with you this Hump Day Happy Hour. In the throes of December, lots of busyness in the office, lots of trying to get stuff done, just trying to put this whole holiday thing together. But I am here with two of my best friends, Dr. Jennifer Bell and Dr. Chad Duplantis. Together, we are Dentists in the Know. And we are all educators. We are all dentists. We are all business owners. And we have one task. Our task is to help bring you in the know. So, guys, welcome. I feel like I haven't done the intro in a while. Didn't go as smoothly as usual. But anyway,
well, we didn't want to critique.
Still
I did love how you opened with "It's your old pal, Jeff," which I think could be interpreted like a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I think I see where you're going with that, and I'm not a fan.
You know, Jeff, at least let's hope that you don't get a call that the roof is on fire.
Yeah. Can you give an update? Because, okay, quick backstory for those who didn't watch last week. In the middle of the show, and Chad wasn't here to provide moral support, Jeff's house kind of started catching on fire. He had some kind of glitch in the electrical system, such that it caused him to leave the show temporarily to go deal with it. So, first question, everybody good? House is still standing?
Yeah, well, we are in our temporary trailer here out on
It looks
downtown.
Good. No,
it worked out really well, but just one of those things. I had left the house. We heard some clicking noises coming from the air conditioning, and so went and checked it out, and I could tell it was coming from the return. Went into the return, kept hearing the clicking noises, and I'm like, "What the hell is that?" Put my camera down there, couldn't see anything, stuck my head in there, couldn't see anything. I'm like, you know what, Jenny, let's just shut the air conditioning system. I'm going to go outside, do the show. It'll be here when I come back. And the next thing I know is we're knee deep in a conversation with Amber Auger, and I see Jenny's face around the corner in the guest house, which, this is my beat factory. Like, nobody comes into my beat factory. No, Jenny just doesn't come. Like, she just knows during things, she just doesn't come out here. And so I see her face, and I can see a look of maybe panic. And so I'm like, y'all saw me. I was just kind of putting my finger up, like, just give me a second, give me a second. She's like, no. Anyway, then she starts sending me pictures of my phone because I keep that up. And she sends me this video. My brother-in-law is an electrician. She got him to come over and take a look at it because she was so worried. But he actually got way down in there in the return, and there is this spark. It's just arcing all the way across our return in there. All of our gas lines run right next to that return for the house. And I mean, we have a gas fireplace, gas stove, gas hot water heater. Like, a lot of our house runs on gas.
You did say you were cold.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, turned out we had flipped all the breakers, couldn't get anything to shut this arcing off, and all of the breakers in the house. Went through that, never worked out. Finally, Nikolai, my brother-in-law, he actually just cuts the service to the filtration system that we had put in, and he starts taking pictures down there, and he's showing me it's like junction boxes and wires all over the place. All I'm saying is the moral of the story is this: your house could burn down at any time after something is put in that you have not actually looked at the wiring from. What I would say is always have an electrician look at your wiring after you have something
That's your
installed.
take home.
Yeah. Great air quality until the fire.
Yeah. With a little bit of an ashiness to it.
Yeah. Best air quality in the neighborhood. Yeah, we own that. Until the fire.
Until you don't.
But anyway, all is good. All worked out. Company came out, sending a licensed electrician over to remedy everything. And
Chad, tell us a little bit about your Germany trip.
That's what I want to hear about.
Yeah, so I did a quick turnaround with DMG. It was their international trip, or I shouldn't say their international trip. It was their international roundtable. There were 7 clinicians there. There was myself from the U.S., so I traveled the farthest.
You represented all of us?
I represented the U.S.
Why didn't we get a vote?
Yeah, I don't know. There was another general dentist from London who we're going to have on the show. He's the ABC dentist. Really incredible young man. I'm blown away by what he's doing. It was really an honor to be in his presence. And then there were 5 orthodontists, 1 from Brazil, 2 from Germany, 1 from Poland, and 1 from Shanghai. And I will tell you, Drew, our guest tonight, would have been blown away. The stuff that these orthos are doing overseas just blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And then I was like, oh my God, why do they have me here? You know? So it was a really interesting meeting. We were in Hamburg. I came from the US. Everybody else came from kind of over there. I was the most jet lagged. Our bus was to pick us up at 8:45 a.m. on the first day there. And I woke up at 8:48 a.m. I had no idea where the hell I was going. I had no idea of cell phone numbers or anything like that. I went into ultra panic mode, and my little ABC dentist from London knocked on the door, thankfully, and was like, hey, dude, are you good? And I was like, I'm good. I just overslept because I didn't sleep at all the night before. Ended up making the meetings an hour and a half late because I couldn't speak German and get there in a prompt manner. But it was truly I don't know if you all know DMG, the company that provides you with Icon, Tempo Sim ID, Honeygum, EcoSite. They have a ton of great products, but they are really pushing to bring us more products. I was blown away by what they do. It was fun. So
very cool.
Very cool. Very cool. And
hey,
also,
what's been going on in Raleigh world?
I think I told you I did like 720 composites today. Like,
Yeah.
welcome to December.
Did you do them standing up?
Must be done in 2 weeks. So,
Did you
and
do
I
them
did
standing up?
2 crowns standing up because the patient somehow can't lay down.
Yeah.
I did 6 composites or 6 teeth. I mean, like 15 composites. You know how that goes.
Yeah, MODFL,
On a
MODFL, none
geriatric
connected.
patient with dry mouth this afternoon, standing up, blood, dry mouth, but there was a shitload of saliva. It was not fun, but you know what? In the end, he was so thankful, and it was kind of rewarding, and it was just fighting the elements to get it done. And I was glad that I was able to help
him. I had a super sweet pediatric patient today who had a pretty oddly traumatic experience with a pediatric dentist. I thought only general dentists created the trauma, and then the pediatric dentist just put them to sleep. But this was an inverse situation. And I was just trying to do a little occlusal on T and tried no anesthetic techniques, several with a laser, and none of it was working. So ultimately had to do a little bit of anesthesia, got him off, finished up. It was traumatic. He cried. It was the whole thing. And then that sweet thing jumped out of the chair and gave me the biggest hug. And I thought, I did not see that coming. I mean, he had been crying and fidgeting and all the things. And I think even then, which felt very traumatic to me, it was still less traumatic than the pediatric visit. Somehow, I still came out on top.
Yeah.
Dr. Drew McDonald is with us tonight. For everyone out there, stick around. Jennifer's going to do the news, but Dr. Drew McDonald, all seriousness, one of the most talented orthodontists I know. I've gotten to know him through the what used to be the Piper Study Club and has now been taken over by Brian Shaw. Have known him from Restorative Academy and from the Equilibration Society. Just an incredibly talented orthodontist that really looks at ortho a different way. He really takes the joint and the airway into account with every case that he does, and he's doing some incredible work now right alongside Dr. Brian Shaw. He's moved his practice to St. Pete. So I'll introduce him more later, but I want you to stick around because I want everybody to hear this interview. It's just going to be fantastic. So with that, JB, take it away. Let's do the news.
You got it. Well, the biggest breaking news as of today is that Patterson was just sold, or at least they signed the paperwork to be acquired by a company called Patient Square Capital for $4.1 billion. Now, the interesting part of this exchange is that it will move Patterson off of the trading docket. They'll no longer be a publicly traded company, and yet will return back to a privately held company within Patient Square Capital. Had a little chance to look up Patient Square because I wasn't familiar with them before this acquisition. And it seems to be a very healthcare focused capital investment firm that is acquiring and investing in healthcare in a very patient centered modality. So we'll see what this means for all you Patterson customers out there as this transition happens. It has to now go through the whole legal and regulatory issues, of course, because it's a publicly traded company. It will have a whole host of other things it will have to go through first. So the ink is not dry yet, but it does appear that Patterson may be moving back to a privately held company and leaving the stock exchange. Couple of interesting other updates. You know, last week I felt very forthcoming with the information to let you know that the Corporate Transparency Act had been stalled a bit. In fact, I was ahead of both my accountant and my husband, who told me 4 days later. He said, "Hey, did you know?" And I said, "I guess you are not a fan of the show," because I had talked about that on Wednesday. I digress. Anyway, as we talked about that, there's been a lot of retaliatory efforts in the courts against some of what many might argue were overreach acts and regulatory issues that were coming out of many of the different departments within the U.S. government. We talked about the Corporate Transparency Act last week. Well, this week, Texas once again comes out as the stalwart state blocking the overtime expansion. Now, if you don't remember, this came out in May earlier this year. It was a bill, or not really a bill because it came straight out of a regulatory agency, but it was a new proposal that would change the way that overtime would be paid to employees. And they would be eligible for overtime much quicker than they would be now, including salaried employees, which many of us use as a protection mechanism for those who work maybe longer hours, but you pay them a fair wage for that time. It was going to start expanding overtime opportunities to those as well. So we knew there would be some type of impact to private practices if they had overtime or salaried employees who would now be eligible for overtime pay. Well, a Texas court has now put in an injunction against this particular Department of Labor rule for the overtime expansion. So this has now stopped that particular movement and said that the DOL has overstepped its authority at this time. We'll we'll see what this means. Again, when these regulatory bodies make these, new proposals and try to push out new rules, it falls in this weird place because it's really not a bill or legislation. So just like the corporate Filing Transparency Act that went into pause last week because of an injunction from a Texas judge, now we have the Department of Labor's expansion of overtime also now in a stalemate. So we'll have to wait for the Department of Labor's response. And of course, we have a new president and a new mindset on the way that these regulatory agencies are going to run. So it may just be that all of this gets turned upside down come late January. So we'll just have to see if that buys everybody enough time for this to sort of settle itself out. The ADA, if any, I saw a post today actually talking about why should I join the ADA? It was $1,500 or whatever the dues for that particular person was. And I think they were younger dentists, and basically saying like, why should we be a part of this particular group? And, most of the arguments were, we're much more impactful as a unified group versus as individuals. And I have to say, I've had the same debates mentally myself. Do I maintain my membership with the ADA? I don't always agree with the decisions that they make, but I can definitely buy into the idea of unity. Well, I found this recent news article very interesting. The American Legislative Exchange Council is now adopting the ADA's proposal model for access and workforce model. So what does that mean? Well, the ADA crafted a workforce model for dental jobs, helping to strategically come up with recommendations that the government can then look for if they're going to come up with legislative or legislative involvement to dictate how dental jobs are solved. Well, it was the ADA's model legislation that is ultimately going to be their reference document when they sit down and start crafting some of this legislation. Well, that's really important. And that the ADA took the time, they had volunteers and paid staff that took the time to build that model legislation and then put it forth to the Human and Health Services Task Force, who was tasked at looking specifically at the Dental Access Model Act. And now they're going to reference back to the ADA and their model legislation to help support where we go from here. Well, that's really important, right? Isn't that why we joined the ADA? Isn't that part of the reason we're a member? Is now the ADA is a participant in that decision making. The government isn't making those decisions on its own without the input of those who know it best, who are on the front lines in the trenches every day performing dentistry. Nope, they're getting their suggestions exactly from the people who should be providing them. Some of the interesting things that are in that model legislation that are up for discussion: authorization of expanded function dental auxiliaries based on the legislation enacted in Wisconsin, authorization of oral preventive assistance based on a pilot program created by the Missouri Dental Association, and model teledentistry regulations based on a current Iowa law. So because the ADA is a national organization, it has representatives from all over. You see model legislation being a compilation from all different states, success stories, best practices for how to solve some of the dental access model and also the dental workforce issues that we're all currently facing. And with that, that's the news.
They did the Patterson thing. Did that go through today?
Today.
Okay,
Wow.
because we were at dinner last night with the new CCO of Vista Apex, who was an incredibly cool guy. And we were talking about this last night, and we were all kind of speculating as to what might happen. Very, very interesting.
Were there already rumors out that it was going to go down?
There was, I'm not going to say rumors, but there was definitely speculation as to what was going to happen. And actually, I believe this came up a little bit last weekend, Jeff, with our friends down here in Texas. Yeah, we were talking about it, and very interesting. It really, really. So thank you for sharing that. I didn't see that news today, but that's
Yeah. So the other interesting thing, maybe because it's publicly traded, I don't know, but because they've now signed that agreement or intent to purchase. Now it actually is open for others to come in and make offers. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes of the next 30 to 45 days for Patterson. But
wow. Yeah, lots of changing in the dental landscape. So
Mhm.
yeah. So anyhow,
Never
hey,
a dull moment.
No.
we've got a wonderful guest waiting in the wings. Should we bring him up?
No doubt. Go ahead and bring him up. I'm going to introduce him because this
Because
guy.
we can't walk and chew gum.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't.
Look
for
at
sure.
JB. Do you notice how fast he brings Drew up? It's like,
Yeah. I almost said honestly.
exactly. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the gentleman that you see outside having a drink in his tube top is Dr. Drew McDonald. He looks like he has, is that a Manhattan or is it an old fashioned?
Just a little bourbon. It's keeping me sort of warm. It's about 60 degrees outside right now. So
Okay.
I gotta have
Wait a
little,
second. You
I'm,
said
I'm
it's
a
cold.
Floridian
Dude,
now.
it's 60 degrees. Shut your
I
mouth.
know. I'm
Yeah,
rubbing it in.
You got us beat by at least 20. So anyway, very jealous. But ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Drew McDonald is he's actually a hero of mine. Anyone who knows, especially my background, having come into orthodontics very early in my GP career, and being so frustrated with the support of the orthodontic community over all those years with regard to things like airway and with regard to the foundation and the temporomandibular joint. What a breath of fresh air it was to meet a practitioner like Dr. McDonald. I've heard him at the Equilibration Society, met him at the Restorative Academy. He's been part of our Piper and now Dr. Brian Shaw study group in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this is just a gentleman who has dedicated his career to the bigger picture and really viewing orthodontic through the realm of airway and TMJ structural management. So a little bit about him. He's an orthodontic specialist. He practices in St. Pete very closely with Dr. Brian Shaw. They work on very many incredibly complex surgical cases together. And I've gotten to see some of his work, and I just have to tell you, forgive the pun, but jaw-dropping. His practice has a really strong focus on joint and airway-focused treatment planning, surgically facilitated orthodontic treatment, and interdisciplinary care for all the patients that come through there. He's been lecturing for some time now on multiple topics, but he is a graduate of the University of New Mexico, went on to Creighton University for his dental school training, and then did his orthodontic residency at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. For those of you who know him, he used to practice in New Mexico and has recently moved his practice to be able to do incredible work with Dr. Brian Shaw. So with all of that said, Drew, thank you for being here. What a pleasure it is to have you, and can't wait to dive in.
Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction, Jeff. Despite your many text messages and emails about my tube top I was supposed to wear, I'm sorry I couldn't do it for you, man. Anyway, I just have the Christmas sweater underneath, so we're good.
You know what? We don't know that there's not midriff showing. There's no proof at this point. It's all I'm saying. The literature doesn't support it.
Tube tops are not good for airway.
No, not really. They diaphragm, it squeezes.
That's right. It's too constricting.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for being here and agreeing to do this. And really, you've been like one of the people I've wanted to get on here so badly because there's really this dichotomy, particularly in the orthodontic world right now, with regard to how we address issues of the joint and how we address airway, and a lot of pushback from the general orthodontic community. So it's not easy for a board certified orthodontist to kind of split off a little bit and maybe think a little bit differently, is it?
Short answer, no. And it's taken me a while because, it took me longer to get in. I didn't just come out of school and know I wanted to get into the airway and joints world. I was very fortunate that the directors I had at Kansas City were very TMJ oriented. Dr. Laura Iwasaki, Jeff Nickel, amazing researchers, but really kind of showed me that there's something to this joint world. At the same time, I had a couple of instructors that were really kind of diving into the airway side of orthodontics. But it was looked at as very fringy. And as you just mentioned, it still is. And it's unfortunate because it is our whole world. And I say this frequently, but every time I touch a patient as an orthodontist, I'm doing a full mouth rehab on their natural dentition. And so all the same things that every restorative dentist, every prosthodontist, every surgeon is looking at from an airway standpoint to a joint standpoint, that pertains to me especially. And sadly, because I'm intervening on young kids' lives, if I don't do it right at the beginning, I'm going to screw up their life the rest of the way. I have a good chance of it. And that's what's sad is, at the practice in St. Petersburg, to a T, the patients that see Dr. Shaw, and then I am part of their treatment, have had 3, 4, sometimes 5 and up rounds of orthodontics or rounds of some sort of occlusal therapy that they've spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and they've watched it fail over and over again. And sadly, that's what really got me into this, were my own failures as an orthodontist early in my career. I was lucky to have it early. And just a little story of how things all came about this way was I purchased a medium to somewhat larger practice in New Mexico right out of school. And Dr. John Cornelli was my mentor. He was who I purchased the practice from. Great orthodontist. We practiced in what's called Roth orthodontic discipline, which is a seating the joint on every patient. You mount the models, you do the same things prosthodontists do, but you apply it to orthodontics. So in my mind, I was practicing to the nth degree of a joint-based occlusal philosophy as an orthodontist. Well, sadly, I saw patients that I had treated, and especially the orthodontic jaw surgery patients that I had treated just like this, sat the joint, put it where I was supposed to, via all of that, coming back with joint meltdown. And I had no explanation other than that, it must be idiopathic condylar resorption. Well, that's not an explanation for anybody. That says we don't know what it is, right? Or idiopathic is nothing. And so luckily, our mutual friend, Dr. David Manzanares, who was also part of Mark Piper's study club, Jim McKee at that point, everybody was, David and I had gotten to know each other, and he's like, hey, why don't you just come with me out to Chicago? I've got this study club I'm part of. I think you might have some answers. And so I came out, and at first I had the lens of an orthodontist. I was going, okay, this general dentist is going to teach me about my job. And sadly, that's what you kind of get ingrained with a little bit in residency is you competed for this spot to go into orthodontics and residency and all this. So therefore everybody who didn't do that must be somehow less than, and it's crap. I will say I do not feel that way, but there is some level, sadly, in our profession of that. And Jennifer, you mentioned that something, you've had some correspondence that has been less than stellar, and you feel like you've been lectured to by orthodontists about things you know more than them about, which is sad. And Jeff, I said this in our most recent meeting, but a lot of what we as orthodontists need to understand about why general dentists and people that aren't orthodontists are diving in and doing the orthodontics is because we're not doing what we need to do to help them. We're not looking at the joints. We're not looking at the airway. We are failing to excel at a higher level of dentistry because our orthodontic residency told us that we need to be dogmatic about something. And that's how we were taught. That's just us not progressing. And so sadly, our profession has somewhat failed the dental profession, in that we just haven't really excelled and taken on new knowledge the way that we should. A lot of orthodontists are, which is great, but sadly, you kind of get looked at as the weird guy in the room, that you're looking at joints and airway, and everyone else doesn't have to look at that because we had our white paper. The AAO put together a white paper, oh my gosh, about airway, and it said we had nothing to do with it. Or back in the 90s, we had, our paper that said TMJ and joint problems don't really go hand in hand. So what's sad about them is there's a lot of truth in the white paper and the TMJ, paper that's out there, because what I see every day as an orthodontist is that patients walk into my office with an already existing airway issue, with an already existing joint issue. And that is exactly what's causing the malocclusion that I see in front of me. So if I am not treating the root cause of why the patient's even in my chair, am I doing my job? Am I, just straightening teeth? Okay, that's kind of easy. And quite honestly, an algorithm on, whatever DIY aligners is probably better than some orthodontists at doing the straightening of teeth, unfortunately. So do we just make ourselves get out of a job by rejecting that we're part of a bigger picture of the airway, the joints, the foundation? I sadly think that right now our orthodontic profession's a little bit on that track where we're just like, hey, all we have to do is teeth. And okay, if that's all we do is teeth, we might not be around doing teeth that much, or the price is going to go way down because there's a lot of options on how to do teeth at home. And even though that those are going away, it's a sad argument for us to say we're better than other people if all we're looking at is just the surface. So that's a lot of what got me.
I love this conversation because, in dental school, as you progress through education, whether it's just regular education, dental education, or whatever, you always realize that there's something that you were amiss on, and I wish I would have paid more attention throughout childhood, junior high, and high school on history, because I love history now more than ever. In dental school, God love him, I won't say his name, but I couldn't stand his class, but it was occlusion. And I wish I had paid more attention in occlusion. The word airway never, I don't even think it was said when I was in dental school. And I talk about that all the time. But the more that this guy right below me has truly taught me about airway, I've realized how much occlusion, function, the whole complex really dictates airway. And what I want to ask you is, what change do you think, or maybe I shouldn't say it that way, what do you think is going to precipitate change? Because I know a really well thought of orthodontist that tells me that the airway in orthodontics is bullshit. I mean, I couldn't disagree with that more, knowing what I know from Dr. Jeff Horowitz. And I know it's a controversial topic, but I think that I commend your instructors in your orthodontic residency, because obviously they allowed you to kind of push the envelope a little bit. What change do we need to see? What's it going to take for that to come to the forefront?
Yeah, I wish I could say research, but there's a ton of research. I mean, even in AJODO, and just it's there. It is coming out. I think what sadly kind of predestined a lot of the thoughts about the airway world was that I've watched it evolve since. I mean, I was in residency in the early 2010s, and a lot of what was happening was people were starting to talk about this, but in like a, hey, you can make, kind of, if you do these things, you'll probably attract more patients by saying that you're doing these things. And then there wasn't quite enough like hard and firm literature at that moment. So everyone got kind of labeled as, oh, you're just trying to exploit and differentiate yourself by mentioning this word airway. And that there's not quite enough to like, okay, what are you objectively doing for these patients? And sadly, we've known for a long time that things like expansion on any age patient, it really does help the nasal breathing. Well, even back to dental school, I mean, we learned about nasal breathing, partial pressures of oxygen, CO2, like how healthy it is to breathe through your nose versus through your mouth, right? But I think we often forget a lot of what we learned back then, but it really pertains to how we practice now. So ultimately, we as orthodontists have the tools. We learn how to expand patients. We learn how to set up the occlusion to be in the right place. We can, help lower jaws have different growth patterns, growth modification, things like that. We just have to use it for the right things. And I think, sadly, what kind of predestined this conversation for airway and especially the joints was that some subsets of more traditional orthodontics just thought, well, they're saying this, they're obviously just trying to differentiate themselves to make more money or try and seem different so that they can attract more patients, versus like, this is the absolute truth. Like, we are 100%, every patient that we have there, they have airway joint issues, tongue tie issues, all of it. We have to be the expert at how do you treat all of it. And so again, I do think that in the future, we'll just call what airway or TMJ directed, that will just be orthodontics, hopefully, instead of just that, or just looked at as like a segment or a fringy part of it. But ultimately, I think what it's going to take to change that is, some of the people who talk the loudest on certain Facebook groups and stuff to either retire or stop caring. But I don't think that's going to happen either. The research is there.
Take you starting a residency, Drew.
Oh, geez. Yeah. We'll see where things go.
Well, so, and I'm afraid it would also mean that you have to say you were wrong. And we as professionals are not super great at doing that. And GPs have to eat it too. We did a lot of things that were wrong. And
I guess why do we have to think we were wrong? It's just, we know better.
I mean,
that's right. Oh no, I'm not saying that to you.
With the information we had at the time. Right. But in doing that, we have to admit that maybe we didn't do it to the best of, what would have been better. And I often wonder too, because the conversation I have with orthodontists a fair amount is, yes, but I see this patient at 30, 40, 50, destabilized, with a myriad of options or myriad of problems at that point. And now I don't know, is it because of the orthodontics that we're in this particular situation, or is it because they were an undiagnosed whatever prior to that treatment and the orthodontics either didn't help or made it worse? And so, GPs do have an interesting perspective because we have longer relationship with the patients. We see them over the course of, if we're lucky, their life. But we definitely see them more in their adulthood as they're sort of transitioning through different skeletal phases. And we're the ones that ultimately get the questions or want patients wanting to find answers. And so my question to you, Drew, is how does an orthodontist sort of reconcile the chief concern of the patient? Like, here's the pediatric patient or teen patient, because we'll say is that 80% of most orthodontic practices that's probably the majority of their wheelhouse. I'm sure many treat adults, but you've got a teen patient that comes in. Chief concern for mom, dad is the teeth are all whacked out. We need to make them look nice and pretty so they can be eligible for job interviews and all the other things. How does an orthodontist reconcile the here and now and the chief concern that the parent or teen or patient is bringing to them versus the long-term stabilization of that patient? And, if you're to impart wisdom to your other colleagues of starting to make that transition in their practice, how do they find that balance? Because people pay them for the here and now, right? Probably more quickly. And
yeah, and I think you hit it right on that. I think us as orthodontists, we have to see the long game of our patients. And I think we've done that in some ways by talking about, hey, if I create the right bite and occlusion for you right now, it's going to be protective of your teeth long term. Right. And so we kind of set a tooth-based expectation for the future for patients. That is something I feel like we do a good job of. Ultimately, though, I think there's, again, a myriad, especially, two big things, the joints, the airway, that we can also see the long picture on. And sadly, the picture's usually there before, again, they get in our chair. And so I think, weirdly, my perspective of the long game has come from treating so many adults, so many orthodontic surgery patients. Again, I got, even before I was here working, alongside Dr. Shaw, I worked with a great orthodontic surgeon, Dr. Pong Ing, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He would set bites he's amazing. But again, it was things that I didn't diagnose that I later on check back on and go, shoot, I think I failed this patient at some point. But ultimately, the way that I've kind of dialed this back is I see so many adult patients, Why did they have to get there? These signs were there early in this patient's life. And so you mentioned the 80% orthodontic practice where it's like teenagers, kind of the usual hot zone of things. I am like the opposite of that practice. I see adult craziness and I see a ton of early kiddos, because I don't want them to get to, sadly, Brian, he'll probably be retired by the time these 4, 5, 6-year-olds get to needing or ever having to. But ultimately, I don't want them to have TMJ surgery or jaw surgery or orthodontics, because we can intercept these things earlier, and we can modify growth on a growing patient better, and especially when they're younger and looser at all their growth sites. Like I said, I know it's a little fringy to talk about treating kids earlier than age 7, but I treat routinely kids, 4, 5, 6 years old, and it's a whole lot easier to get actual skeletal expansion on a 4, 5, 6-year-old because they're looser in their sutures. You can modify growth better. You can, if they're a class 3 little kiddo, you can get better forward pull on a maxilla on that age group than even an 8, 9, or 10-year-old, because they're a lot more locked in with their growth. And, studies show us this, and we learned it in dental school. 85% or so of maxillary growth is done by age 5. So what if we wait until 12 years old, right? What's left in the tank for that? Not much. Same with mandibular growth. We sadly have, and again, a lot of good papers that looked at when is it timing to correct a class 2 and help the mandible grow. And a lot of them point towards, and again, this is in a traditional setting, long papers that were done decades ago. So not a lot of early intervention really done on like the little kiddos, but a lot of time what we were taught and what has made sense through research is let's just wait until their pubertal growth spurt to tackle that, to really try and help the mandible grow. Well, there's not much, again, growth left. There's 70% or so of the ramus height is done by age 7 or done by age 5, actually. So what are we going to get left in that puberty growth whenever we could have maybe identified things early? So speaking of mandibles and how the TMJ even gets involved in this conversation is, and every orthodontist listening knows that you come across kids, adults, teenagers that they've got like clicking, popping jaw joints. And sadly, back to, again, our literature in the 90s, and I don't think it was wrong, but basically that paper kind of said, hey, what we do orthodontically doesn't, make things better or worse with the joints. I think it's right because, again, these patients often walk in with the joint issue of a clicking, popping jaw. And the sign at the surface is a class 2 malocclusion. So again, lots and lots of literature supporting that when you have a disc that gets displaced on a young child, that you don't grow the same at that condylar growth center. And so if it's on one side, we see asymmetries towards that side of the mandible going towards the side of the bad disc. If it's bilateral disc displacement, the mandible doesn't grow forward, you have a big class 2. Well, what is 70% or so of our day as orthodontics? We're correcting some sort of class 2 asymmetric bite. We don't see class 1s walk in. Class 3s are a little bit more rare, but your day primarily as an orthodontist is a class 2 malocclusion. And so the biggest mystery and frustration in ortho too is like, why do some people grow better than others? And we've had like really minimal evidence to really point towards like, okay, what, there's been some papers and some long-term growth studies that show like, hey, vertical mandibles don't grow well when you try and put them in a functional. Okay, well, vertical mandibles also go hand in hand with disc displacement. So if you're trying to help someone grow that doesn't have coverage of their growth center, are you going to be successful if maybe you're putting more pressure on the joint because it's not protected there? Yeah, that's the risk you run. And so in my practice, what's kind of interesting and unique, but what I try and make sure people know is you very often, if these kiddos that have these bad malocclusions, we better be looking at that joint, and not just with the CBCT, but we need an MRI to be able to see that disc in a lot of these cases. And I will tell you, the youngest kiddos I've been able to do MRIs on have been age 6. I've had multiple of them. Some kids are great at that age and can do it just fine. Those disc displacements are there early in life. And again, it's already affecting their growth of their jaws at that age and manifesting in a big class 2. And if we just try and correct it and say, hey, I hope they grow, we can actually do worse. There's a very recent paper that the people in the study, they were all confirmed to have one disc displacement that did not reduce, and the other joint had a disc displacement that did reduce. So super hard to find population, right? Well, what they did was they put these patients in a Herbst functional appliance, and they monitored them and checked them over the course of a year. Well, on the side that the patient did not get back underneath the disc, they actually saw degeneration of the condyle, versus the side that they got underneath of the disc, they saw growth. And again, this isn't one single paper out there in a silo. There is a myriad of evidence back to, again, Mark Piper, Kurt Schellhaus, the radiologist, just from the 90s and 80s on to now, have just showed us this time and time again. And so I think the time is now that we need to not be afraid to look at these joints when we see a class 2 patient. And the MRI, again, is not a barrier that I find for patients coming to my practice. It's actually something that patients seek out when they know it is valuable for a reason. And sadly, again, all these patients that have to see, Dr. Mark Piper, formerly, now Brian Shaw, they have had, sadly, no one really look at these joints a lot of times and just say, hey, what I'm going to do is going to work because it's me doing it. Not like, hey, here's the imaging saying what's under the surface for you as the patient, and here's what's predictable and here's what's not. And so, Mark Piper taught us this. It's the imaging is the image. It's the truth. That was the first thing he said the first time that I was at his study club was, what you're going to see on the screen here is truth. And that kind of set in with me because I was like, hey, well, he's right. You can't fake an image. You can't that's literally black and white right in front of you. And so I do feel, to now quote Jim McKee, it sets us free because we've showed the patient their what's under the surface, and now it's about options and where do we go? But they start to own their issue.
I gotta stop you for a second and I guess answer a question that's been out there for a long time for me is why do you think the orthodontic community saw things like joint-based occlusal issues and airway conditions related to orthopedic anomalies? Why do you think they saw that as a threat? Because what I would challenge is that this was the single greatest opportunity for the orthodontist to say, we're not orthodontists, we're dental orthopedists. Like, you study the skull, you study growth and development, you study all of these structures, and yet we're still training orthodontists to use the malocclusion as the primary diagnosis, when the malocclusion is not the primary diagnosis. It is really a sign or a symptom of a foundational problem or potentially a functional problem secondary to airway. And not always. I mean, we know that there are patients who are, genetically a little class 2 or a little class 3, but so many of the malocclusions that we used to, at least for me, a lot of people still do, so many of the malocclusions that we diagnosed as a malocclusion problem really had its basis in a foundationally based problem or an airway problem that hadn't been addressed. So I guess, why did the orthodontic community, instead of saying, hey, let's embrace this, we're the keepers of all things orthopedics in dentistry, this is a huge opportunity for us, instead, focus on defensive moves, like the white paper that came out about 4 bicuspid extraction, and it almost seems like they took more of a defensive stance than saying this is a huge opportunity for our specialty.
Yeah, I think Jennifer hit, I think Jennifer hit that right on earlier, which is, sadly, I think we get defensive because we think of liability and that, we didn't, we must have done something wrong. Well,
but you can't be held liable for something you didn't know about. Yeah, that wasn't common practice.
Yeah, and that's I think that is what the roots of this, especially like I said, back to the 90s, there were sadly orthodontists that, there was a lawsuit that kind of spearheaded the joint side of things. And that there's, we needed to have an answer for this. And I think as the airway side of things was growing, like I said, through the 2000s, 2010s, it was like, we need an answer for this. How much are we involved? And I'm with you. We should have taken like hey, we can own this because we actually learn the skills very well in a residency of how to, land the plane on these patients. How do you move the teeth to set them in the bite? How do you help the jaws to grow? That back to our title, we're not just, you don't walk out of orthodontic residency with just orthodontist. You're an orthodontist and dental facial orthopedic specialist. That is 100% the title you walk out with when you've gone through a certificate, whatever. So I sadly think we forget about that last part, which is dental facial orthopedics. We help jaws grow. We help things move. We help expand jaws. That is a big part of our
Some of
life.
you do.
Well, we learn how to do it. Whether you do it or not, that's up to you and your skill set. But I do think that the evolution of what we are as a practice, we maybe took a wrong turn a little bit. Hopefully we can write it back and come back. But this is the evidence is there. It's not like it's building and we already reached the critical mass, quite honestly, especially on the airway side, the joint side. It's just, getting it through that this is something that we have to do. And that is the leap. And so back in history for me, like I walked away from Mark Piper, Jim McKee's study club that first time and I went, okay, I just saw something that terrified me. And now what do I do about it? Like, that's the thing is like, okay, what I think I can't unsee this now. But now I'm going to have to order an MRI. Where do I even start for that? And oh, by the way, if luckily I had a CBCT, but if I didn't, I'd have been like, well, now I'm going to refer every single patient to an imaging center. Are they going to want to see me? Are they going to think I'm crazy? Because now I'm making them do all these extra things that the guy down the street isn't doing. And so, like I said, I think I started to tiptoe into the MRI world because I was like, I see it. I don't know if I can get patients to do this. Let's see how it goes. So I kind of went with the slam dunk patients, right? Like the big time orthodontic surgery patients that were huge class 2s, asymmetries. I was like, hey, let's do this. There's a lot of evidence that says that this type of malocclusion can be really related to a joint problem. And oh, by the way, if we don't fix the joint problem, we might leave open the back door for relapse. Evidence is right there for it. Ultimately, I did a few MRIs the first year after I came back, and every single one of them was just what Mark said. That disc is off, that joint's breaking down. So again, from my standpoint, then I started going, okay, well, how deep does this rabbit hole go? And so I started doing more MRIs on the kids, the more traditional orthodontic kids that had the class 2s. And sure enough, these class 2 kids or asymmetric kids were off the disc on the non-growing sides. And so then it's like, okay, well, now how early is this happening? And that's where it started to go, all right, this little kid in my chair already has click and pop and joints. That means his disc is not attached the way it's meant to be. And oh, by the way, they've got these growth patterns already starting early. Like, how early do we need to be intercepting? And the answer is as soon as we see it. And that could be at whatever age. And so again, back to some magical age that we've determined as orthodontists of 7, that slogan actually is every kid by age 7, not at age 7. So again, that could mean way earlier if there's an airway or joint issue that's present in our face, and we can help. We learn these tools. Actually, technology is really helping us execute plans better. Like 3D printing, expanders has totally changed how you put those on these little kids. You don't have to jam a spacer in there. You don't have to fit a band around this and have the kid, crying and all that stuff there. They literally slip right on and they fit like a glove. And the worst thing I'd put today, I saw a 1 6-year-old and then one 5.5-year-old that got their expanders upper lower. They were both the 3D printed variety. They went right on there. And the worst thing that they experience is that the glue tastes bad. And it's like, well, if you can invent chocolate glue, you're going to retire in 3rd grade and call it a day, right? So anyway, that's it. Like, there's no pain. It's just weird taste. And so not to get too far down those details, but man, all of our things are saying not only should we be seeing this, but oh, by the way, we can do it and a whole lot easier than traditionally it used to be. So we,
How-
it's there for us if we want it.
How much we've had other guests on that have talked about the origin story of all this. And some of it is skeletal growth and development. Some of it is genetics. But the argument has been made, much of it goes back to nursing, and that, those breastfed babies tend to have better skeletal development. The palate expands and responds to that better. Nasal breathing is better versus bottle fed. Do we have scientific literature yet that would help continue to validate those arguments and sort of, creating the long narrative? Because again, it's the long play, right? It's not just seeing them at 6 and 7. It's saying, how do we empower moms and dads with kids to say optimal growth and development looks like this? Granted, not everybody can do that. It's not to shame, but it's almost to already prepare them for the ideas that things may not develop quite the way that they would want to, or that there may be further conversations that will have to be had.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the evidence or literature on the long game. That's certainly, it's there. It's all, it's just sadly in different journals than we're used to looking at.
Than we look at, yeah.
Yeah, and so back to one thing you brought up that is an interesting thing. I'm not trying to go off topic here, but the genetic side versus the inflammatory side, right? Or the external versus internal, right? Well, what we know, again, and David Gazal, I love this guy and what he does, but let's talk about the gut microbiome for a second. But if you're changing, if we're doing things naturally the way we're meant to be as humans in terms of breastfeeding, and I'm not singling anybody out, but instead of thinking about it as it's forming the palate from the tongue, let's think about the inflammation in our body with what goes into our gut and what doesn't. So sadly, a lot of formula, and I have formula kid. My 12-year-old daughter sadly had some issues, but and she's nonverbal autistic. There's a whole myriad of things, and she's a big part of why it got into the airway side, especially. But a lot of gut inflammation. I see it time and time in with the kids that walk in my office. They have terrible adenoids, terrible tonsils. Their sinuses are just completely obliterated all the time. And it goes hand in hand with the gut inflammatory side of things. And so I do often work with functional dietitians. When I do, and these kids start to get right in their gut, like their inflammation levels are way better. Like they're sleeping better. They're, you're kind of healing the way we're supposed to be. And what comes up all the time are these, it's not full-blown allergies like celiacs. It's all these sensitivities and sadly kind of way off gut microbiomes that are just throwing us into these hyperdrive, side, of our sympathetic nervous system is just up here. So again, I didn't want to take like a huge foray into that, but that is one other big piece of this. And obviously the tongue forming, breastfeeding is a big part of at least some mechanical stimulus. But let's talk about the inflammation side. And that's another piece back to genetics is, okay, if we're going to talk about the, our certain growth patterns genetic, like we talk about class 3 genetic, well, is the inflammatory profile a big part of that for that patient? Yes. And we learned about it in orthodontic school. We learned that certain patients have higher IL-1 beta levels just genetically than others. So that is an inflammatory interleukin, inflammatory cytokine thing. So, okay, if certain people have that and they're more inflamed than other people, okay, well, are they possible predestined to be more of an inflamed airway patient? Very likely. If we're going to talk about genetics of joint stuff or class 2s, well, what we know is, things like joint laxity, Ehlers-Danlos, they're extremely underdiagnosed. And I can tell you that, so many kids in the families that have, mom has joint issues, teenagers have joint issues, all that, and they all look the same with the retrognathic side. I've seen a ton of these families, sadly, and especially in St. Pete, that, they are all hypermobile or have some variety of this hypermobility under the surface. So is it genetics that just told us that we're going to have a recessive mandible, or did genetics predispose us to a joint injury or predispose us to more inflamed airway scenario? I think that the genetic side is going to tell, as we learn more, it's going to be along those lines, not just like you were programmed X, 0011 that to have this mandible back. It was you were predisposed to certain things that now made you have that phenotype. So,
I know that you didn't want to go off topic on the gut biome, but I think all of those topics are so important because many dentists, I've definitely had this experience where you're sitting there talking to a patient and the parent, and you're seeing all of these contributory factors. And you look at the mom and you say, any history of reflux, any history of snoring? Like you're just starting to kind of like pick little questions to sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together. And you can almost see them like falling because pediatrician hasn't been asking those questions, hasn't really been digging, into that piece. And they're like, yeah, and I've been concerned about this, and this, and nobody seems to be hearing me. And so even though gut biome is a little off topic, it's really good for dentists to continue to put all of these little pieces into their armamentarium when they're having those conversations to say, yeah, and do we have, good bowel movements, or do we have a hyperinflammatory? Let's talk about their diet, not from a karyogenic perspective, but just in general. I think all of those things are so important because I just find dentists engage in those conversations maybe more frequently even than the pediatricians do, or at least the parents open up. Whatever the reason is, you start to find yourself going down the rabbit hole with them a little more frequently.
Yeah, and I frequently say this to my team in Albuquerque, and as I grow out here in Florida, but we are like the primary care people, like right now, like because we're in people's mouth. There's an obvious oral systemic connection of our health that we notice these things right here in this region a lot. If we are taking the images, doing the diagnostics, and we stumble upon an airway, not stumble upon, but if we see an airway issue, see a joint issue, see a neck issue, things that affect this patient the whole way, we actually have an opportunity to help this kid get better in direct care. And sadly, back to, like I said, I'm not ragging on pediatricians, but they don't have time for this. That is not the model of medicine right now, is that you walk in and get a full diagnostic workup. Like if you go to Mayo or something like that, they're sadly, the model is set up to be more reactive than proactive.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. But we see the problem, and especially as orthodontists, people don't walk into our office with a perfect bite and no problem. They go, okay, I recognize, or I've been referred to come here to fix this. And what I say is, I got to get to the heart of why this happened. And oh, by the way, these things of joints, airway, tongue ties, all of it need to be part of my diagnosis to say, how did you get here? And they also need to be part of the solution. Because if we leave one of those back doors open, we're going to leave open the possibility of relapse and things that we, charged them money, said we were better than other people at, or whatever you did. It's going to possibly fail. And then you're going to be like, well, they're going to blame you, not that they had an issue there in the first place that we tried to help them with. So it's
Drew.
if you show people, yeah.
That's such a great point, and we're gonna have to cut it off because we've already gone over. Honestly, I could sit here and have this conversation for another 2 hours, 3 hours easily, and I don't know that all of our listeners would be hanging with us, but I really think most of them
Who cares?
would. Yeah, and who cares for that matter? But really, I think the last comment that you made was so poignant. It's not about the what, it's about the why. It's not what they present with, it's how did it get that way in the first place. And the fact that there are people like you out there asking those questions, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Not here's what you have, here's how I've been taught to fix it. It says everything about our profession and where our profession is going. And thank you. I know you have stepped a little bit outside of the boundaries of where a lot of orthodontists feel comfortable, but thank goodness there are clinicians like you that are willing to do that and really be on the cutting edge. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we are definitely bringing you back on because this conversation needs to go on in so many different directions.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And just to one last point, it's coming because I do hear after I do any teaching talks or anything, I get emails from orthodontists, and the majority of them are positive. Like, hey, I do want to learn more. I really, I see that I just saw 3 patients today that look just like what you said. Like, where do I go? How do I learn this stuff? So I think the hope is out there that for you guys that this is going to the wave is here on people who care about this. It's just about, getting that, that push. And I think it's going to happen sooner than later. And I don't know that some orthodontists want to hear that, but there's a lot of interest, and it is going to become the mainstream to practice with a much more holistic, big picture look in orthodontics, especially. So I don't want you to get too discouraged. Yeah.
The cool thing about that will happen is GPs like me and Jeff and Chad, who right now maybe don't have people to refer to because they're not practicing on the same stream, if you will, or like we get better as they get, like it kind of is this very synergistic relationship. I'm not afraid to get better, but at the same time, if you're better alone on an island and no one can support you and you don't have specialists that will kind of go on that same path with you, it becomes incredibly frustrating to say, well, I have all this knowledge. I would like to put it to use in my patients, but I have nobody in my community that's also kind of rowing in the same direction. So as orthodontists and other specialties sort of embrace these new ways of practicing, their GP partners are going to be right there with them, ready to grow in their own education and sort of follow that same path.
Yeah, that's great. It needs to be synergistic, like you said. So can't wait for future what happens here.
Yes.
I love it. Good night, guys. Chad, close us. I don't want to close out either, but we have to at some point.
All right, I'll close this out. So we were talking about the things, well, I mentioned earlier, the things that I missed growing up and then in dental school, and I mentioned occlusion. Drew stole the words right out of the mouth. Occlusion is one piece of it. There's so much more that it all needs to be brought together. I mean, occlusion is fundamental, but we need to take into account the airway, we need to take into account the joint, and they all need to work together and be synergistic for the life of our patients, simply put. And it's really nice to see an orthodontist that gets it, that's willing to kind of buck the trend, if you will, and do something maybe a little bit outside of what the norm is. Throughout this conversation, I was shooting texts to the orthodontist that I work with. I was like, hey, we got to go see this guy speak. And I encourage everybody to go see this guy speak because he is phenomenal. If you listen to half of what he said, I guarantee you it's 10 times more than what you knew already. So thank you so much for being here, Drew. I look forward to having you back because I think we just broke the surface tonight. And I think there's so much more beneath that we need to get to. So thank you so much for being here.
Out there. I'm sorry to interrupt you. One last thing I want to throw in is, so I have to say that Dr. McDonald, Dr. Shah, they have actually been working on what is called the Faces First protocol and Faces First seminars. And I've been with them very closely through this process, and we're really trying to develop something that makes it easier to recognize what is happening at the diagnostic phase and bringing all disciplines of dentistry together, how a case needs to be handled from diagnosis to, they have a joint, an airway, an orthodontic problem. What do you do with them? But it really all goes back to the primary diagnosis and what the face tells you. So it's Face First. Look it up. Stay tuned for that. And do please follow Dr. McDonald and Dr. Shah, because what they're doing down there in St. Pete is unreal. And sorry to interrupt you, Chad, but I wanted to throw that in for sure.
No, that's fine. I was done. All right, everybody. Have a great night. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Good night. Thanks, Drew.
Bye, guys.
And that wraps up another podcast for Dentists in the Know. On behalf of Dr. Jennifer Bell, Dr. Chad Duplantis, and myself, remember that we've got a great profession, so let's make it a great day, Dinks.